panels. We've got Lee Hadley from Abraham Derby, but Joe's kindly stepping in. Joe Edgar there. Hi, Joe.
Morning, Joe.
I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but Mandy Dallywell from Colebrookdale. So we've got Yvonne's kindly stepped in there.
Okay. Okay, right. So should we move on to checking the accuracy of the minutes? If we just go through each page to start with. Any issues with page 1? Are we happy with page 2? Page 3? Page 4? And page 5? Everybody happy with those? For those of you who were at that meeting. Okay, thank you. Just got a couple of matters arising. I know some of the items are on the agenda anyway. So just on page 2, there was an action from Simon about 3.3 about asking for volunteers on the education notice board. Has that been done?
I'm just looking, Claire, sorry.
That's okay, don't worry. Just trying to fill the vacancies on the forum. It was in regards to primary governors and for academy pros.
Right, no, let's put that. No, we need to do that. Apologies. So let's
That's
pick
okay.
that up and we put that forward. Yep.
And I think everything else is on the agenda. Oh, under AOB on page 5 on 8.1, there was a discussion at the last meeting about the regulations and about whether how long the recording had to be on the meeting on the website for. And Andy was going to have a look at the regulations to see if there was a requirement for the streams to remain on the web.
Yeah, there is nothing that says they've got to stay on the web, so we've deleted them.
Good.
Which I feel was what the forum wanted.
Yes, preferably.
And we will delete this one tomorrow, Claire.
Lovely.
Get
Happy
this
with
one deleted.
that. Okay, thank you very much. So shall we, does anybody else, sorry, have any matters arising before we move on? Okay, so if we move to agenda item 4 then, in regard to the delegation for school quality assurance services, I don't think it's probably necessary to go over the background because we've discussed this item so many times. I know there's been a working party in place to try and iron out some of the issues. I know consultation has taken place, but I believe Simon only has 7 replies actually to the consultation. Simon, do you want to just say anything about the working party? Although I think it's all really clear in the papers in terms of what was agreed at the working party, but I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Not necessarily clear, and I agree. I think this has been well discussed over the last few months. I do want to thank colleagues both in terms of the working group that have helped to have that discussion, to challenge us, and then to help us form the new model going forward. I also want to thank the primary heads execs who have formed that conversation as well, and I really hope that you feel that we've kind of come back to you, listened, and I understand that moving forward, the ask is there, and it really is about making sure that we've got a really credible offer going forward in terms of that quality assurance role. I think that what has been helpful is just recognizing that we've got to do a bit more so that everyone in the system understands the difference between quality assurance and school improvement, and we are going to revise that protocol as well to make sure that that is crystal clear and our role as a responsible body when Ofsted come through the door as well. So it's been a really, really helpful discussion, and I mean that. So. But like you've said, Claire, I'm not necessarily going to go through the context. I'm not going to necessarily go through the paper. You can see what the proposal is, and really now just kind of seek that vote from School Forum as to how to move forward.
Absolutely. So I know Rachel and Robert I think you were both on the working party. Is that correct? Anything else you wanted to add?
I couldn't attend the last one because I was dragged somewhere else, so I missed that. So apologies for that. But no, nothing else to add from me.
No, and I think probably the key thing that I sensed from colleagues, it was around having that credible person to fulfil the role, as well as the funding issue. So are colleagues happy that we move to a vote? And am I right, Andy, that this excludes academies, so it's a maintain vote only?
Yeah, it's just maintain schools or that have a vote on this one.
Okay, so are we?
Can I, Claire, sorry to interrupt. Can I just say
Yes.
that I had feedback from around about a dozen heads, and the general consensus, there were a few points that they raised. So can I raise those now?
Yes, of course you can. Yes, yeah, that's fine.
So first of all, it was would it be reviewed after 12 months, because they would prefer that to be the case again after 12 months. That was the first point. The second point was a little bit of concern around, are we going to be able to recruit somebody who is credible into that position? What is the field? Who are we going to get that is credible? And then they really appreciated the fact that it isn't going to be 100% and that it dropped to 75%, and they appreciated that. But even with that drop, it is still quite a significant amount of money. So it was the can it be reviewed again after a year? What are we going to do in order to recruit somebody who is credible? Because I don't know what they don't know what the field would be. And then the final point that came forward was, has there been an agreement with the local authority and STA about those attending STA SIPs attending with the local authority to inspection, so that they can support as well? So those are all the points that I gathered from my researching.
So I think I'll go to Simon, but my understanding on the 12 months is because it's around delegation, that is an annual thing we have to do anyway. Okay. But I'll leave Simon to answer the other points.
Yeah, you're right, Claire. Yes, so every 12 months this is voted on, so we will collectively do a review of the situation. The second thing, in terms of recruitment, I share the concern, because effectively we went out this year to try and make sure we had a credible offer, and we didn't hire into that position. But after the school vote, depending on how it goes, if we're in a position to start that recruitment process, we're going to go for it straight away, thinking about the model from April. The issue around LA and STSA being able to have jointly go into a meeting with Ofsted is outside of our control. It's outside of STSA's control. It's Ofsted's decision. So I will go back to the message that I sent out before to articulate that. But we've had discussions with Ofsted, and I'm very, very clear that it's up to the lead inspector as to whether or not they want both people in the room. So that isn't a decision for myself. For some reason, we have some lead inspectors who are very, very fine with it, and some who seem to have an issue with it. From the local authority's perspective, we're very happy for both parties to be in that room. So if you like, we're not putting in a barrier. Right. We're not putting in any barriers.
That was really the question. Is the local authority in agreement? And you're saying you are, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. But just so we are clear, it isn't our final decision, if you like. It's Ofsted. And the other thing is that there's a risk pushing Ofsted to have both parties as well. So, we just kind of sit on the fence, but please feel assured that we're not putting any barriers to that process. What was the next one? The next one was the drop in 75%. So can it be reviewed? We have to review that every year in line with how many transfers we might have in terms of mainstreams going into academies. We'd have to review that in terms of the salaries of the people involved in delivering the service for you. So yes, that will be reviewed every 12 months as well.
But I think Simon and Tim, when we move on to look at the other agenda items and we look at the funds the LA have received for central services, I think we have to be realistic that actually if we want quality, we may not get that 75% as we have this year. Heather, sorry. Heather's got a question, Simon, for you.
I have got a question, but the other thing, just in relation to what Simon's just said about Ofsted, that's come on the meetings that I've been to in the training for Ofsted. That's really, really clear, and I've seen the communication. and it is absolutely clear it's down to the lead inspector. Whether that's right or wrong, that's absolutely how they choose to prioritise their time during the inspection. But Simon's absolutely said he's really on board with whoever the school improvement partner is, whether that's through SDS, whoever it might be, attending those meetings jointly. The only feedback that I've had is the question about when we talk about a credible person, about the specification of what we class as credible.
I think one of those points, Heather, was around the head teacher experience, wasn't it? And I think that's again in the papers been agreed.
And it's whether or not it's somebody, you know, potentially who's it's difficult, isn't it? It's the link with, you know, inspecting, etc. Whether that would be a desirable. That's the question that I was asked anyway.
Yeah, so yeah, it would be, and I think the desirable candidate would have definitely had teacher experience. Ideally, they would have Ofsted experience or be linked in there as well. But you know, the field isn't huge out there, and we're also going to be very mindful about the cost and then what we're able to afford. But that will all depend on the outcome of the vote, essentially. But I am, like you, determined that we've got an offer that makes sense for all of us and helps us in our endeavours. So, you know, we do want to change what's going on at the moment.
Okay, any other comments, Collie, before we move to the vote? Robert?
Sorry, yeah, it's just a question for me on like the financing of the money. Obviously, if you haven't got someone in post yet, obviously you're spending money now. Why? Obviously, how's that been backtracked to this year in the cost? Is there any sort of money saved over because you've not spent it because there isn't someone in post?
I don't understand, Rob, because we have got somebody in post. We've got Jo. Oh, I can't remember my colleague's surname, but we've commissioned her to support. Yep, and we've also got.
Yeah, so but like, obviously of a financial year from April to April, that appointment was only in September, so there's 6 months before that person was appointed.
No, because we've also got additional appointments with. It's difficult, isn't it, with colleagues' names? I've got additional appointment with Claire, and I've also got Rebecca and Liz covering that role as well in that duty, and they've been taken off other duties and other work, which is unfortunately building up as we speak. So we're covering the duties, because we had that agreement last year at School Forum to move forward with the model. So I've prioritised delivery of the protocol above lots of other bits of work. So we've delivered on the money that's been given to us, and it is going forward. But yeah.
Okay. Any other comments or queries? Okay. Let's move to a vote. Are we doing show of hands, Andy? How would you like us to do the voting?
You muted, Andy.
Apologies. Yeah, so I mean, if people just put their hands up, that's a fair vote, as long as everyone can see them.
Okay, so if we can have a show of hands for approving the delegation amount.
Andy,
please.
can I just check in terms of so as the Prue vote, I know it's maintained schools, but is the Prue included in that one too?
No, it's mainstream maintained.
Super.
Sorry.
That's fine.
They're not special either.
No.
So who, to clarify then the vote, we're looking at Rachel, Christabel, Robert and Yvonne?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know how to put my hand up digitally on this phone, so I'm just going to put my real hand up.
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay, so we've got 3 votes. Okay. Oh, 4 votes. So yeah, that's all.
So all in favour, yeah?
Yeah, all in favour.
Thank you.
Okay,
colleagues,
colleagues.
Claire, can I just say thank you as well? And I do appreciate that,
you know, we've
got some work to do. No, but I think we've worked well together on this quite challenging topic. So I just want to say thank you. Okay, cheers.
Okay, thank
Claire,
you.
apologies, I've got to depart now. But
well, I think that's rotten as you stitched me up for this job in the first place.
I promise I'll be better behaved in the future.
Okay.
I just wanted to be there for that vote, that was all.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Rachel.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, bye. Bye.
Okay, so if we can move to agenda item 3, please, school funding. So obviously since our last meeting, we've had the final allocations for schools, high needs and central school services, DSG block. Tim, is that correct?
Yeah.
And this is and it's gone to cabinet.
Yeah.
For approval.
Yeah.
So obviously I'm not going to go through the paper, Tim, but I don't know if there's anything on here that you want to particularly outline any significant changes, but I think from reading the paper there hasn't been much that's changed since we last looked at the figures.
No, the only thing I think that's being clarified is there was some additional money announced in the autumn statement. Obviously, it wasn't clear what that was going to be. So it's now come through, and it's going to be a separate grant outside DSG, which is not that helpful, but I mean, it's still extra money, and it is quite substantial. So for Telford schools, the increase according to the DFE is about 5.9%, and it splits pretty evenly between the main DSG and the additional mainstream schools grant. So the DFE have issued how they're going to allocate this money, and we've got something now, I think, on the forum webpage which shows for our schools what it would amount to. The actual allocations, official allocations, won't come through until May. So schools can plan around these sums with, I think, confidence. But it has sort of, a bit like last year when again there was a supplementary grant, it is created like a dual system of funding where you've got the main DSG plus this. Having said that, I mean, it is actually quite a good settlement for schools in the context of other public services. So according to the government, again, you have to take this with a pinch of salt because no one knows what pay settlements are going to be. So for schools, when everyone says, oh, it's a real terms increase of X, they don't really know that because they don't really know what the pay award is going to be, and that's the main determinative cost for schools. But on the face of it, it should allow schools, other things being equal, and on average school to keep up with more or less what we expect inflation to be. So it's a reasonable settlement. In terms of formula, as we said before, we've had a policy for a good few years now of mimicking the national funding formula because that's the way national policy is moving. So we're just going to continue to do that. Caveat is there can always be some slight changes because of timing differences and when the data is measured for a school funding point of view on an individual school level and the DSG coming to us, and because it depends on things like the amount of money we get for growth and how much we dish out for growth, that sort of stuff. But in principle, we try and mimic the funding formula. Any differences from it are normally at a fairly small scale. So that's pretty much what it will be.
Tim, can I just ask, on 1.7, there's a reference to the minimum per pupil funding levels.
Yeah.
Are there many schools that are sort of triggering that protection of the minimum funding guarantee?
There certainly were quite a few. I think they may have gone down a bit this year because I think that amount has gone up in less in percentage terms than the main funding formula. Have you any idea, Andy, around about the numbers of schools who are on that for coming year?
I am just rushing now to open the worksheet, and I'll be able to tell you exactly how many schools will be on it. It's not as many as there was last year, and likewise, because you got the two guarantees. You've got the minimum per pupil and then the minimum funding guarantee, which aren't the same thing. So bear with me. I do apologise. Do you want to carry on chatting, and I'll try and get this worksheet open, and I can answer your question?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. I've talked about mainstream, Claire. Maybe if I just briefly say something about the other areas while Andy's looking.
Yeah. Particularly want to look at early years as if we can.
Yeah, so we'll do high needs, then perhaps we'll go back to Andy, then we'll look at early years, which will come up at the next meeting as well. But
I've got the worksheet open now.
Go on, Andy. Yeah, far away.
Right. So on minimum funding per pupil, we've got 2 secondary schools. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 primary schools. The minimum funding per pupil is the one whereby it's targeted at those schools that haven't got a lot of deprivation or prior attainment.
Just an idea, Andy, what's the sort of sum total of the funding being distributed via that route this coming year?
It's almost £1 million, £998,000.
Yeah, so quite significant. Think about the numbers of schools. I think that was 13 schools in total.
Yeah.
So if, I mean, obviously secondaries are bigger, but if you divvy it up, you're talking 80 grand probably pop on average. So quite significant.
Yeah, I mean, there is quite a big variance. The largest allocation is £211,000, and there are a couple on there that's less than 1,000. So yeah, it really does vary dependent upon size and deprivation and prior attainment. That's the kind of amount we were actually using in the minimum funding guarantee, which is still there, but that now just pushes out about 50 grand, and it is really small amounts to 4 or 5 schools.
Mm. Okay, that's interesting. Certainly a lot less than it was years ago.
Yeah,
it's diminished a lot. Yeah.
I think you tend to get a movement into these two types of protections when the government decides to change how they do their formula, because you always get that lag of schools needing protection until the former catches up.
Okay, thank you, Andy. So high needs, Tim?
Yeah, high needs. So a bit similar to mainstream schools funding. So we got the DSG amount and then some additional grants on top. So in total, about 35 million, which is an increase of about 3.4. So again, a reasonably substantial increase, as we've seen in high needs rather for last couple of years. But just to emphasise, it is needed, certainly locally. We haven't finished the current year off yet, but we're looking at something like a zero-ish DSG balance on it, something like that. And because we carried some DSG forward, that represents spending, an increase in spending in 22-23 compared to the previous year of maybe, again, these figures will move around a bit by the end of the year, but maybe about 3.8 million. So in other words, if we weren't getting in something north of 3 million extra per year, we'd be heading into deficit. And as was being repeated, it's, you know, a number of forms, that is where I think most LAs are now. I think something like 2/3 of LAs are in one of the government's intervention programs as we speak. So we are doing much better than many LAs, but just to point out the only reason for that, as well as, you know, what we like to think are quite good internal processes and relationships with schools, etc. But we are reliant on more DSG coming through each year. If that ended up being like a 2 or 3% increase, which the DFE has mooted at some point will be where it will revert to, then on the current trajectory, we would be heading for problems fairly quickly.
Yeah. And we may not be in a deficit, but we certainly don't feel we've probably got the funds to meet all the needs that we have.
No, it's every year we look at what our commitments are, and there's a process of trying to make sure we sort of reduce them where we can, basically. I mean, as people are aware, the highest costs tend to be when children go into independent placement, sometimes out of borough. So we very much try to keep an eye on that and try and sort of reduce that as far as we can. Again, we've done better than that for many other authorities, but you know, it's not just a case of where we can just blithely spend whatever is needed in quotation marks to be spent. Having said that, what we have tried to do and continue to try to do is not just be reactive. So we're not just trying to say, here's another 3 million quid, let's just let it flow through the system and see what happens. What we're trying to do is build resilience in mainstream schools. We're still in the process of doing that because we're trying to future-proof the system, as well as we think that's the best thing for the children as well. So we are trying to have an eye to, you know, the future world. We can't necessarily assume we're going to get 8-9% decrease in funding forevermore in this area. So we are trying to make the system more resilient, but it's by no means easy. I say, because we're doing relatively well. I know it sounds a bit like a stuck record, but just to remind everyone, this is not an easy situation, and it could easily head into deficit for us. We are very dependent upon DFE policy on this one.
Okay,
Funding
Heather.
otherwise.
Heather, have you got a comment?
I just want to reiterate really what Tim says, you know, as the maintained special schools are all in year deficit budget positions. I'll give an example at the bridge. You know, we had a 1% uplift, and I think our TA rises, what was it, 9.2%, something like that in the bottom scales. And obviously, when you've got more, it's a significant, so it is huge. And just, you know, I think we're going to have to do some huge working together, because in 2021, to put it in a context, we had 30-something children come into a reception year, of which, other than one, I think, they were non-verbal with no understanding of language, which is a huge number of children, isn't it? You know, it's huge intake for an SLD, PMLD school, and that will push pressure upwards for us to be able to take the most complex children.
Heather, I think we're seeing that in maintained sectors, children coming in non-verbal, and just reminds me to bring up a point, Simon, that I did mention to you some time ago about the changes that were made to the nursery provision at the bridge, whether I could have, still waiting for some understanding of what happened with the nursery places at the bridge, whether that's, sorry, go on.
No, I think primary heads is next week. We're going to come and start the kind of centre conversation, because you're articulating the pressures that are coming through. We need to explain the and it has been over time, but I think it's come to a head this year in terms of the reduced number of places at the ban, and then what we're trying to do to balance that out with early intervention. But there's so much pressure within each bit of the system: special schools, mainstream schools, early years providers, really feeling the needs coming through. But that conversation is a strategic one that we need to start, and we're going to start next week at primary heads.
Yeah, which sort of leads us nicely into early years, because that's where your pressures are, isn't it? Is around your high needs and your early years funding, and quite concerned really about the situation in early years. And I probably could say that maintained nurseries probably supported by school budgets, but PVI don't have that luxury.
Yeah, very mean increases, I think. I mean, I went to a DFE briefing on this, and the first sort of DFE speaker spent the first 3 or 4 minutes kind of apologising for the very low increases, saying they were lobbying internally, and so they clearly recognise that this. Well, it's nowhere near enough to keep up with inflation, to be blunt, is it? I mean, if you look at the increases in the living wage, which are relevant particularly, I would say, for PVIs, we look at energy costs, we look at the general level of inflation. I don't see anything in the system that's affecting early years providers that's giving increases of 1%, 2%, or even 3%. I see everything going up by significantly more than that. So there's no getting away from it that it's a very poor settlement, I think, for early years, and obviously flies in the face of all the rhetoric about early intervention that everyone is in theory signed up to. I mean, from our point of view, I mean the early years budget will come to the next forum, but basically we'll pass on the increase that we've got to settings, and not an awful lot more we can do really, other than, like everyone else, lobby the government. But at some point you would think the financial resilience of the sector is not going to work. You can't just
you've only got to look at wages in April. Minimum and living wage go up by 9.1%. So we go from £9.42 an hour to £10, which, to be fair, they all deserve it and they deserve more. But when that funding's not coming in, I mean, across the country, there is settings that are actually now not taking 3 and 4 year olds, and parents are actually paying, because the setting says basically we either close because we can't afford to take them, or the parents pay. I mean, fortunately in Telford Wrekin at the moment, we haven't really lost many settings, just an odd one here and there. But I think the tide's going to turn, and I think we are going to struggle.
Tim, can I just ask? I know with the hourly rate, there's an uplift that can be applied, isn't there, for deprivation?
Yeah.
And there's an uplift that is applied for that flexible offer.
Yeah.
And are those things that we have agreed? I think they have, that we've agreed to do locally. So is there not anything that we can do through those measures to increase what we roll out to settings?
Yeah, I mean, obviously what it doesn't do is increase the quantum of funding, so the quantum is the same. What we could do is we could shuffle money, say, into the base rate, the basic hourly rate from these areas. But if we take, say, flexibility, I think I'm right in saying, Andy, that the vast bulk of settings get it currently. It's not quite universal, but it's very close to being universal.
Yeah, but that got decreased, didn't it? The same as with the deprivation, or that got changed about 3 years ago.
Yeah, we've got a limit now into how much we can put into supplementary factors. So I think it's been increased to 12% this year, and it used to be 10. But the only reason it's gone up to 12% is because of the teachers' pay grant. That's right, Andy, isn't it? Which, because we have to dish that out as a supplementary amount, then it was going to sort of push the supplementaries up. But fundamentally, we're still sort of locked into that sort of limit. So at the moment, we couldn't, even if we wanted to, give out much more via those routes. As we say, we could reduce them, and then we put that money to base rate. But the practical implication of that would be not very much, because flexibility is nearly universal, and it's a standard amount. If you get the sort of flexibility, it's not like a tiered amount, depending on how flexible you are. It's just a XP per hour added on. And deprivation, you'd basically be saying we'll take money out of settings with more deprivation and give them settings with less deprivation, which again would be a difficult one to justify. So there's
Tim,
some limited flexibility, but
can SEND be a factor?
There is. We do each year. We put aside some of the early years block. I think it's £200,000, something like that, for SEND, and we have to do that. Again, the government makes a requirement that there's a sort of a fund for that. But it's not sort of that's not part of the funding that goes out the funding form to settings. That's to fund sort of applications when settings have got children with high needs, and we'll pay out additional resources.
I just wonder whether the link between high needs and early years funding, whether there is more we need to do around the increase of SEND that are in these early years settings. And again, I don't want to do maintain. I know maintain are feeling that pressure, but we've probably got, you've got Senkos and provision in places, but it's huge in maintained, even where we probably got maybe some more resource than PVI, but it's a huge factor in maintain. So I don't know how PVI are coping with taking these children that are non-verbal, which we seem to have an increase of, into the PVI sector and maintained. Sorry, Simon.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I don't want to give empty promises, but we absolutely are looking at the level of funding going into early years around high needs. So, and actually we're looking at the level of funding that's gathered through top up, and we're looking at increasing that level. Now, what I want to do is want to just make sure that we've got our figures and facts right before we come and present that, but that is an absolute ambition. Also, we're trying to look at how we're increasing the top up in mainstream schools as well, so to recognise the complexity of need. But yes, Claire, that's an avenue through which we're hoping to pump some additional funding.
I mean, and PVI are getting a lot of non-mobile children as well. So we're getting children coming in with lots of equipment, lots of medical needs, etc. And our funding isn't, our bands aren't like what they are in school.
Well, can I just say, and apologies, but watch this space. Just hold fire for a second, and things are being talked about so that we can level up that funding. I can't believe I've just used that phrase.
And Yvonne was just reiterating that point in the chat, and about the impact of, if we don't get it right in the early years, the impact it has in.
Couldn't agree more. And just to reiterate what Tim was saying, are disgusted really in terms of assessment for early years, and we are, where we can, making that point well heard.
Okay, Tim, is there anything else from the paper? Did you want to talk about the central school services?
Only briefly. I mean, we talked about it last time in terms of the vote to support central services, just to make the point that that's been squeezed harder than any other part of the system. Not surprisingly, given the government's attitude to local authorities, but it is a little bit galling that the government pays for licenses for schools centrally, and then it just basically bills local authorities, and that comes out of central school services. Now, as you know, with everything else, there's a vote on it in the forum, so we will have a discussion about it. This one, there's no vote, there's no choice. We just presented with a bill, and the bill this year went up by, I think, about 13%, which squeezes everything else in central school services block. So the amount of money available is going down modestly in cash terms every year, and obviously by considerably more in real terms. So I'd say, I don't want to labour the point, but just to say again, and going back to the vote on school improvement, there's a consistent squeeze in local authorities which has not ceased. It's continuing.
Yeah, you get not surprised. Thank you, Tim. Has colleagues got any more questions around the school funding for 2023? Okay, so move on to agenda item 5 around the growth fund, because it's not so long ago we looked at this, didn't we, Tim, back in May, and we were looking at the growth fund for new schools and agreed growth with schools.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this can get a bit confusing, I think, because we do fund growth, and we've funded growth the last few years, but we've done it without a growth fund, which sounds a bit perverse. But the way that circle is squared is that the way we fund growth is we do it via estimated numbers. So if a school is going to increase its PAN or go above PAN without agreement, then we will then fund the school based on estimated numbers, so there's no lag. and that's treated as part of the funding formula. And therefore, technically, you don't need a separate growth fund. So as Claire said, earlier in the year, we then created a growth fund because we've got a new school, Allscott Meads, opening this September, and we need to provide some opening cost support for the school. So we had a forum vote on that in May, I think it was. And we had assumed that would probably be it for the next couple of years in terms of that's the only reason we would need a growth fund. But we do now have another reason for it, which is that as part of supporting the increase in numbers in secondary schools, Thomas Telford have agreed to take 26 more Telford Wrekin pupils. And I should emphasise it is Telford Wrekin pupils. It's been specified from our area in year 7, then in successive years. So they're basically the same as other secondary schools. Many of the secondary schools have agreed. But the difference with Thomas Telford is that because it's one of the, I think, 2 remaining CTCs, City Technology Colleges, they're not part of the general funding system. So the normal way in which we would fund schools via the funding formula, well, we don't fund Thomas Telford through our funding formula. So there's no way of applying growth through that route. So what we're intending to do instead is fund their growth on the same principles as other schools. So we'll fund it based on estimated numbers, but we'll do it via a payment from the growth fund. So the reason it's come back to the forum is this is an extension to the sort of rules around the growth fund for this reason, and we need your support in order to agree the criteria by which we'll allocate this funding.
Okay, and can I just clarify who's voting on this?
Is this a whole school forum vote, Andy?
Yes, it's with the exception of Penny, unfortunately, because you're not funded through that system at all. Sorry.
Okay, comments or to vote? Okay. No comments, so can we have a show of hands, please?
It went very quickly then, Claire. I didn't hear that, sorry.
Did I? Sorry, I just asked if colleagues had any comments, and if not, we'll move to a vote. If we can have a show of hands, physically or through the chat. Okay, Andy, did you get that?
Yeah, I think that looks like everyone was in favour. Could I ask if anyone was against it? Okay, all in favour then, yeah?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so moving to any other business. Tim, have we got anything else?
Not from me.
Simon?
Nothing from me. No, thank you.
Colleagues, anybody? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much, folks. The date of next meeting, 9th of March, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
everyone.
For Mandy, whether that meeting will be on Teams or will it be in person?
I think we're planning on it being Teams.